This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew. Welcome to the Craft Beer and Brewing Podcast. I'm your host, co-founder, and editorial director of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine, Jamie Bogner. I am down for a socially distant but in-person podcast today, taking advantage of proximity here in Colorado for a conversation with Jake Gardner, head brewer for Westbound Down. Welcome to the podcast, Jake.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Jake, most recently, the 2019 Great American Beer Festival won silver medals for double barrel Louie barleywine, and in a really easy category that nobody competes in, an American double IPA won a silver medal for Westbound double IPA. So we're going to talk about some of those beers through this. Congratulations, by the way. That was totally sarcastic. Some excellent accomplishments. They won Mid-Size Brew Pub of the Year last year on the backs of those medals. So, of course, we're going to talk about those. I don't think we've ever really talked about barley wine here on the podcast. And so I don't know how we've gotten into this 3 years later. Actually, I guess this is, episode 154 that we're doing right now. And somehow I've never talked about barley wine. But you get to be the first, Jake.
I'll take it. Yeah, it's something I've been very passionate about for a long time. Love to talk about it.
Cool. We're going to nerd out on that. We're going to nerd out on West Coast IPA. I've been enjoying some of the recent Westbound series they put out with the Western Conference All-Stars and getting creative with some of their brewing peers in that kind of American West Coast IPA space. Before we do it, nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partnered with G&D Chillers. Innovative modular designs and no proprietary parts propel G&D ahead as the premier choice for your glycol chilling needs. Breweries you recognize like Russian River, Ninkasi, Jack's Abbey, Samuel Adams, and a bunch more brewers that you've heard on this very podcast all trust G&D to chill the beer you love. Call G&D Chillers to discuss your project today or reach out directly at gdchillers.com. Also, BSG is partnering with Leopold Brothers to bring a new line of small batch handmade malts to brewers and distillers. Leopold Brothers is a family-owned floor malting operation and distillery and 2020 James Beard Award finalist located in Denver, Colorado. Since brothers Scott and Todd Leopold first opened their doors in 1999, they've created everything from classic unfiltered lagers to a number of spirits, including a wide array of whiskey styles. Learn more about the upcoming malt line by going online to bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact BSG at 1-800-374-2739. So, Jake, the way we normally start off the podcast is talking about you and how you got where you are today now as head brewer for Westbound and Down. Talk to me a little bit about your brewing history and how you ended up here.
I moved to Denver after going to school at CU Boulder. And admittedly, I was planning on just taking a year off and going back to school to get a PhD in English. And two things: I'd moved in with my girlfriend, now wife, and I needed a job. In the meantime, I was an avid home brewer at CU and some homebrew clubs. And anyway, I didn't really care how much money I made, just 1 year off. So applied to Great Divide and Breckenridge Brewery. Breckenridge was offering 50 more cents an hour, so I took that job, stacking boxes and working on the bottling line, and worked there for about a year and a half, all the way up to junior brewer position, which I think they kind of just made up for me because I was pretty aggressively passionate about it. I started doing some work for Cicerone. At the time, they were like a brand new thing.
Sure.
And was just like a super nerd, and took that test, and they like called me and were like, who are you? Do you want to work for us? And I was like, yeah, I'm 22 and I, work for Breckenridge Brewery. So got into some beer history stuff with them, and knew I wanted to do something smaller where I could be a bigger fish in a small pond. And in that first year, my wife didn't want to move to the programs that I get into for English, and I had fallen in love with craft beer and realized I wanted it to be more than just a hobby, and you could potentially get away with doing this for your whole life. So figured I'd give a hack at it, and around that time, I was making some beers with Tim Myers at Strange Brewing, which was just up the road from where Breckenridge was in those days. This is pre-AB InBev, 471 Calumet location.
Right.
And everybody at Breck was amazing to me back then, and a lot of them were running around and going to Strange after work. It was right up the street. That's when extremely small microbrews, like this nano brew kind of concept, was just on the horizon. Like, people thought it was nuts that Tim had opened a brewery making 1 barrel of beer at a time, and this was 2011.
Yeah.
And so I'd go by for his 1 barrel Wednesdays and got to know him, started making beer with him. And one thing led to another. I met Stephen Kirby, who I wish I'd listened to that podcast to know exactly what he said about me. But
he said good things. It's all good things.
You never know that guy, though. So, no, I imagine it was good things. He's still one of my best buddies.
Yeah.
And amazing guy. But I met him. He's been good friends with Tim for forever. And I met him there, and my passion for beer history kind of connected me with Steve. So we started talking, and he was talking about how he was opening this brewery, Hogshead, and they were going to be making cask conditioned beers, which seemed totally nuts at the time. I mean, there weren't even people making beer on 10-barrel systems really then. There were, but it was only if it was a brew pub. It was a very unique concept that Tim had going. So then Steve's talking about, making cask conditioned beers and recreating some of these, Barclay Perkins style, porters and best bitters. And I was really drawn to that. It was kind of a weird time in craft beer where, West Coast IPA had been taken to an extreme. There weren't like a lot of new avenues, and these guys were opening these tiny places and trying to do crazy stuff. And so I met Steve, and we started making some beer together, just for fun. Like, after I'd worked the graveyard shift at Breckenridge, I'd go up and make beer at Hogshead. And he's like, "You're hired. Do you want to be our head brewer?" So I had the privilege of being the head brewer there from 2012 to 2017. And learned a lot from Steve, who has a crazy background, not the traditional background you hear of a lot of in craft beer. So it was fun learning from a guy who was reading all these ancient brew books and was very inspired by Shut Up About Barclay Perkins. I don't know.
Yeah, Ron Pattinson.
Yeah. He's an awesome guy. We got to make a couple collab beers with him while I was at Hogshead. So anyway, during that time, my 3 partners in Westbound Down were Mud Club members at Hogshead. And when I started making Belgian-style beers and, West Coast IPA, sometimes not to Steve's liking, but, if anytime he was not paying attention, I'd be like, "Yeah, we got another lager and new double IPA coming out. And we'll put a couple on cast to keep you happy."
The picture of Steven, reacting to that is just priceless. In my head, it's just priceless. I can just imagine the shit that he gave you for that.
Oh, it was almost unbearable. But I think that's why we always get along, because I would put up with anything, but it didn't necessarily change how I was going to behave. So I'd be like, "No, yeah, we won't do it again." And then a week later, I'd be like, "Well, I was inspired and we did it again." And I'd come up with crazy excuses back then. Like I was working with, I'm going to blank on her name right now, but a flavor scientist at the Denver Science Museum at the time. And she was doing some talks with Andy Parker at Avery.
Yep.
That led me to an excuse to make an English IPA versus American IPA. Well, really, they were both just West Coast IPAs, but just using hops from those countries. And for this class we taught at Big Beers, and it created this whole series that then made making tons of IPA at Hogshead somehow excusable. But yeah, so was at Hogshead anyway, met the guys at Westbound. They said they were going to put a brewery in Idaho Springs. I told them I thought that was not a very good idea, admittedly. I didn't understand the throughput of traffic there, or the fact that everybody that lives in Colorado drives right past that.
Yeah, winter and summer.
Winter and summer. So I got involved with those three guys and we started designing. And at first, admittedly, like I said, my time at Hogshead was incredible. I lived 3 blocks away during the time I was the head brewer there. So I initially told them I would love to be involved. But it'll be 5 years ago. So I was 27, 5 years ago in December. And I was like, yeah, I can just do both. I'll be your head brewer and Hogshead's. So I did that for a couple years. I was engaged then, not married. And that was awesome, but it was crazy. I mean, I was literally brewing beer like 85 hours a week, working all the weekends. But at the time, I was either brewing beer or drinking beer. And that was like, unfortunately at 32, I'm running out of the energy I can do it 5 days a week, but 7 is a little bit of a grind. So I didn't want to do anything else. So it was awesome. But then, when I realized I hadn't seen my wife in a couple months, at some point it kind of hit a point where Hogshead was, had their own demands and Westbound was growing and needed even more of my time, and there was no time left. So that's when I had to go. But yeah, that's kind of how we got started with Westbound. And it's fun, that we started with some guys that were just drinking Edda's Pale Ale, which is a beer I named after my dog, at Hogshead on cask. And we're like, we should start a brewery together. And that is legitimately how it started.
So 2017 then for Westbound and Down. What's
15?
2015 for Westbound.
So there's a 2-year overlap where I was doing both. Maybe not a full 2, but it was 19 months.
Let's talk a little bit about brewing, but before we do that, this episode is brought to you by Mountain Rose Herbs, purveyors of the highest quality organic herbs, spices, and teas. Whether you want to add depth to your next golden triple with classic notes of cinnamon, pepper, and clove, or artfully layer exotic, zesty grains of paradise into a perfect ale, adding botanicals to your brewing is an easy way to customize a delicious flavor profile. Mountain Rose Herbs has been providing organic herbs and spices to chefs, herbalists, and dedicated brewers for more than 3 decades. Learn more at mountainroseherbs.com and get 10% off your first order with the code CRAFTBEER10. Also, Yakima Valley Hops is your hop source, whether you're brewing 5 gallons or 5 barrels. Get all the hops you want when you want them. They source the highest quality hops from the Yakima Valley and premium growing regions around the world so that you have access to the largest hop portfolio possible, even the hard-to-find varieties like Citra, Nelson Sauvin, and Galaxy. Homebrewers visit YakimaValleyHops.com, and wholesale accounts find them at spothops.com. So naturally, Jake, I want to talk about West Coast IPAs first. This is something that you won a silver medal for last year for Westbound Double IPA. It's something that you've kind of been building and expanding on with the Western Conference All-Stars series, brewing collaboration West Coast IPAs. With folks like Melvin and Barley Browns and Cannonball Creek and some others. So talk to me a little bit about how, in the time that you've been brewing West Coast IPA, how you've watched the style shift.
Yeah, I think, like I said in the beginning, I think, West Coast IPA really defined, American craft beer for all the time I've known it, which is 2005 on, 2006 on, and has kind of been morphed into a ton of different things. And hazy IPA is certainly, even if it's distinctly different, I think has caused a resurgence of West Coast IPA, but also a resurgence with a new attitude and new changed ideas of what it can be, what it should be, and what's enjoyable to drink. And I think overall in craft beer, I know we're going to talk about barleywine, so that will be disparate from what I'm getting ready to say, but I think there's also been a return to people, finding beers they can drink, and drink multiple of. So, I've been passionate about West Coast IPA since I got into craft beer as a home brewer, but we've kind of saw it go through this phase of these bittering wars, who could make these tongue-ripping bitterness, to the point where it kind of almost thought the style was going to be dead because the beers became almost unpalatably bitter, and somehow that was made you cooler if you were doing it, which was an absurd track. Now, maybe in a decade we're going to look back on what, I'm doing with, Alex Bakken and Phil and now Derek and, our buddies at Comrade and Cannonball. And we love making beers with those guys here locally. And we're going to think, man, that was absurd. The dry hopping rates we were doing were totally ridiculous.
No, you're not going to look back at this that way. You are going to look back at, wait, we put that much sugar and finishing gravity in our stouts. There will be regret had in future generations of brewers, but it's going to be about, re-fermented fruit puree. And it's going to be about just massive finishing gravities on these pastry sets. But I digress.
Make sure your A1C tests are covered on your medical insurance.
Right.
With those beer styles.
So I'm not worried so much about you and looking back on West Coast IPA and with any kind of regret. No, I think that's important that what you said. I think that our understanding of quality of bitterness and our understanding of drinkability was influenced by New England style IPA, and whether it's late hopping techniques and ways to get different flavors out of hops, certainly that style has changed the way that brewers approach West Coast IPA. And I guess if we really go back and look at the history, there were brewers brewing West Coast IPA who were also exploring those ideas simultaneously, I think, with a lot of New England style brewers. And, and so I think those kind of the evolution, it wasn't the, New England style, they made it happen for West Coast IPA, but it was more like, it was happening at the same time and ideas were feeding off of each other and it just moved together that kind of way.
Without a doubt. I mean, you look at guys, basically everybody who's ever made beer at Pizza Port Carlsbad, were, running with ideas along this line of very dry, fairly delicate IPAs that had very firm bitterness, firm in the way that, by the time your glass is back on the table, you're like, that does have a little bitterness. And then it's back in your face and you're drinking more. And I think that's what we've come to realize is that a lot of these beers, they need firm bitterness to keep you coming back for more. But the definition of what firm bitterness is has been kind of recontextualized to be something that's just enough for counterbalance, and then find that and then maybe go a little past it. And I think you're in the sweet spot. Whereas previously, I think people saw some sort of oomph or strength in their beer that was maybe, I don't know, some sort of bizarre ultra masculine thing of like, oh, I like them really bitter.
Sure. I think we can blame Stone, to some degree for that, for this kind of arrogant bastard approach to like, let's make it unapologetically in your face. And if you don't like it, then it's not for you. And that kind of branding and outsider stance. And it's not just Stone. There's plenty of others that are also on that same kind of wavelength. But that was I think a relic now of history where we've realized, and just from a straight business perspective, like brewers sell more beer when you can put a beer down and you want to drink another one. That's just, it's straight up mechanics, and it makes so much sense on a conceptual level. But those beers that, you just scrape your tongues off after them were just not drinkable beer after beer. Talk to me a little bit about the evolution again of how you have started and began reshaping that idea of bitterness in your West Coast IPAs, and where you were 2012, 2013, and then some of the steps that you took to where, get to where you are today.
Well, I mean, admittedly, at different points in my life, I've been, more of a beer geek, some points less. During almost all of the time frame you've named, I've drank a lot of beer at Cannonball Creek. And a lot of beer at Comrade. I think they both have pretty distinctly different approaches.
Yeah.
But without a doubt, those Marks and Hutch are, probably two of the biggest influences on me making West Coast IPA. And I think they're in distinctly different camps. But I think, during that period of time, you've seen, it's almost like while people were exploring more dry hopping rates, later Whirlpool edition, to the point where literally they're cool pulling it and they're not even adding it at full temperature during Whirlpool. At the same time, I think you're seeing West Coast brewers seeing, legitimate use of those techniques while also realizing I've still got great counterbalance, to mouthfeel, and that ability to want to pick your glass back up, lowering the IBUs 5, then 10. And suddenly, you're realizing And I think a lot of these brewers, the two I named plus us, I mean, we're certainly not getting IBU tests done on all these beers. So,
Right.
I mean, it's a theoretical 40, 35
Really?
on a lot of them, but, could be higher, could be lower. We're using different
tastes a little bit higher, in terms of, but partly I imagine that's impacted somewhat by the fact that they're dry, whereas
perceived bitterness too. I mean, anytime you get those dry hopping rates up that high, I know a lot of people talk about, bitterness pickup and dry hopping. I certainly think at extreme levels that's, not only theoretically possible, but it's happening. But I think also you're just seeing perceived bitterness. I mean, I think a lot of the beer drinkers who are drinking these IPAs get very in tune with expectations and other beers they've had. And as dry hopping rates increase, you start to believe it's going to be bitter, even without any. I mean, that's, I think, a lot of those East Coast IPAs, hazies, were so shocking at first and had so much kind of curb appeal because it was mind-boggling. It smelled like it was going to be so bitter, and then it wasn't. And that was like, whoa, this is so outside of the box of what we were expecting.
And so drinkers didn't have a frame of reference from which to actually, to even understand it, but that created a certain level of interest.
And then I think, too, the biggest thing I've seen, since I've been making West Coast IPA professionally is just how much more knowledge there is to the game. Like previously it was like there'd be a new hop and everyone would jam a ton of it in. But there wasn't a lot of theoretical approach to it. People weren't trying to understand hop lineage. They weren't trying to understand oil composition, certainly not playing with thiol precursors, biotransformation. These were all, words I'd never even heard of till maybe 3 years ago.
Right.
So I'm not saying no one knew about it. Obviously, white winemakers down in, New Zealand have been messing around with those kind of terms for quite some time. But then those approaches of trying to, select yeast strains with enzyme potential for biotransformation, working with hop combinations, even if you've never used the hop before, but realizing, what kind of oxygen fraction of the hydrocarbons or one type and how to match them up with another hop maybe you've never used, but the puzzle pieces seemingly will fit because of other beers you've made before. And I think when the science is more applied, and I certainly don't claim to be any sort of hop oil expert, but, with certain tools that are out there these days, Scott Janis's book, The New IPA, obviously there's some limitations on his, I don't know if anybody hasn't been to that website, it's pretty impressive, homebrewer or otherwise. I think it's just scottjanis.com, but he's got like a whole spider chart prediction of, yeast strains and certain hops and where you use them and what it'll look like. That was not the world of making West Coast IPA in 2015.
Right.
It was kind of like, oh yeah, citrus, cool. I'm going to use a ton of it. That was like the limitation of thought. But I think, you're seeing people kind of try to draw out these nuances of hops. And I think when we're thinking about any beer, really for that matter, at Westbound, I like to think about two different kind of approaches to beer. And some beers you approach with a very fine window, a very defined set of goals. So with the barley wines that we're going to talk about, I would describe, before we'd ever made that at Westbound, the Louie series was a beer where there was a very defined goals. We knew what English barley wine tastes like historically. We knew we wanted it to be bigger in alcohol, more akin to, Deal with the Devil or Mother of All Storms from Pelican, and that, that same malt bill and ester profile, but in a much bigger sense. We knew it was going to go in a barrel, and we knew we were going to put it in a bottle, and people were going to age it for a long time. Like you were telling me, you still got the OG double barrel Louie. So, there's when you're thinking about that, you've got a number of different goals to accomplish, and some of them contradict each other. The beer it's going to be in a barrel. There's going to be oxygen. We got a microbiology issue potentially. We've got high alcohol. We want a strong ester profile, but we want fusel alcohols low. and how are we going to manipulate all these things? And we can talk about that more later. But
damn it, Jake! Don't try to segue me to barley wine. Yeah, we haven't talked about
but
West Coast
I'm
IPA
coming
enough.
full circle here. Let me come back. So, just because I didn't know they were going to be so segmented, but these things connect because those are really defined goals, right? That's like 10 hoops we got to jump through.
Right.
And there might be more than one path through it, but it will be very clear how we're going to navigate to, accomplishing all those goals. Conversely, when we approach West Coast IPA in a rotational series with, in some cases, hop varieties we've never used, malt varieties we've never used, or, a new type of hop product, cryo hops, what have you. The goals are more broad. I mean, the goals are, we know we want really dry beer that's very approachable and complex. But, I've been going to some flavor classes with Sweet Bloom Coffee, awesome coffee roaster here, just as like kind of a fun mental space to be, away from beer, but still in touch with your palate.
Sure.
And those guys use this term clarity, and they use it very differently than brewers do. Not like how clear is the liquid, but connecting a flavor in your, on your tongue to a specific word. So, in the case of IPA, maybe citra hops, if you just said it's citrusy, that would be very mild clarity. Whereas if you said Cara oranges, that would be very precise clarity, connection to a distinct thing. And so when I say there's broad goals versus very defined goals, it's okay, I think, in some ways to approach some of these West Coast IPAs that it's like, we're on this exploration. We've never made the beer before. We've got a very good idea of where we're going. But we're not sure whether we got Tangelo oranges or Cara oranges. We're hoping it's defined when we get there. But we think we can make something great. And you can envision in your head, it's like, never seen a blue horse on fire, but I know what all those three things look like separately, so I can imagine them together. And in that kind of same way, we kind of approach this whole Western Conference All-Star Series. And it's fun because a lot of times we're doing it with other amazing brewers who they're on the ride too. They haven't seen the blue horse on fire, and we're just going to try to figure out how we get there. And it will be, a yeast strain we're familiar with, or a hop combination they're familiar with, and maybe a base malt variety both of us have been wanting to use but haven't had a good excuse to. And a lot of these have been in the COVID era, so it's like, a Zoom call. We ship them some beer in the mail. They ship us some beer in the mail that they think has been either they've made that's inspired them. And we kind of try to get to this space that neither of us really know what it looks like. And it's kind of cool to be doing both those because, like I said, I think they're very different approaches. And at least to make that first batch of beer, I think they're both very valid approaches. I do think on the second and third iterations, it's important to, if we were to remake any of these Western Conference All-Stars, I think we've hit a couple of them out of the park. I think we've worked with some amazing brewers. If we hadn't, it would be almost embarrassing with the lineup of people we've been making beer with. But I think you've got a chance to, you've always got a chance to improve. I mean, we've made beers we've made 80 batches of, and we're still tinkering with it. So that's where you kind of take that broad and make it the more tangible and the more defined, and the goals become, very critical both in numbers and in flavor profile and in how these beers stand up in a can now that we're canning beer. So
Sure. Well, let's try to move from broad into some more specifics. Talk about some of the parameters that you are tweaking through that Western Conference All-Stars series, and also talk about some of that kind of molding, shaping, and honing process around Westbound Double IPA that you feel may have moved it off of the final table and into that kind of metal position. As I talked to Ben from Breakside about this a while back in, I guess, in February, same kind of thing. Like, he has his own process of figuring out how to optimize for pleasantness is the way that he refers to it. I'm always curious about how you move through that honing process. So let's talk about some of those details for a minute. Before we do that, ABS Commercial is excited to be a part of today's podcast. ABS is a full brewery outfitter offering brew houses, tanks, keg washers, and small parts. ABS wanted to do something fun for the craft beer industry, so they're giving away an ABS Keg Viking keg washer live on December 5th, which happens to be also National Repeal Day. Go to www.abs-commercial.com, click on the Keg Viking page, and fill out the contest form for your chance to win. Also, if you enjoy this podcast and want to support our mission to bring you valuable insights from the world's best brewing minds, Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions are the best way to do it. Get a year of the print and digital editions of the magazine, plus access to our library of video courses, a special deep dive email, and more. Go to beerandbrewing.com and click on the subscribe button to join now. All right, Jake, during that break, you grabbed us some beers and just poured a beer that is, as of yet, unreleased, but it'll be released soon. It's a new edition of the Western Conference All-Stars, and it's a collaboration with La Cumbre out of Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Yeah, so this is, we released these in pairs. It's kind of fun. When we started this series, like there were no sports because of COVID, and we thought it was kind of fun to have our group of brewers like loves kind of talking shit to each other, and there's a lot of competitive nature between just us and a lot of our relationships with, Bierstadt and Comrade and Cannonball here locally, and like Mike Albachon at Pizza Port, and some of our best buddies in the industry kind of have this competitive nature about our beers. So it felt fitting with no sports to kind of do a collab with two people at one time in a common style, and then let people kind of, have this competitive edge that, if you get two beers from a series at one time, everyone's going to pick a favorite. So there's a natural, competition there. But yeah, this was a fun one. Irway down there is a hell of a brewer and somebody that definitely has influenced me from the beginning. I was just saying, before I knew whether we were on air or not, we just canned this yesterday, so excuse a little bit of its bottle shock. I expect it to be a little more explosive aromatically. We've kind of learned along the way that just as the Germans understood filter shock and bottle shock, some 50 years ago, that the same kind of theory applies to packaged West Coast IPA or any kind of hoppy beer. Not that the beer isn't great right off the canning line, and I think romantically we wish that was its freshest moment. You think fresh. Trust me, we're still fresh. That's why, the born on date's right on top of every 4-pack holder. But I think 3 to 5 days later is usually the sweet spot. Sometimes as much as 2 weeks. But definitely like in that first 30 days, I think is where all IPAs shine the most. But it's kind of interesting seeing some of these beers where off tank, they're explosive. And then, you drink it in a can, like the first night you get home, you're like, this is really good. It's not jumping out of the glass. And then like 72 hours later, it's just back to like, boom. You're like, oh, that's the beer we thought we made.
Interesting. Yeah. Talk to me a little bit about some of the fine tuning that you've done over the last couple, 2 years on IPAs that have helped. You mentioned, before we started talking that you'd, over the last couple of years of entering, targeting the double IPA, targeting the IPA categories, that you'd had a lot of luck in competitions getting to the final table, and you just weren't able to kind of break through and get into that metal space. What was it? What have been some of the factors that you've been able to kind of push around in order to try to make them a little bit more appealing to both stand out, but also hit the middle, hit these styles in ways that, judges will relate to them as firmly a part of that style, while still having a unique character that sets them apart and makes them interesting in a kind of environment where people are drinking lots of these beers?
Yeah, I think, obviously 2 GABFs and 1 World Beer Cup and, 3 final tables and no victories. It's, you're kind of beating your head against a wall without a doubt. And especially too, because like I mentioned before, you only get the notes from the first round. So they'll usually just say, check all the boxes and tell you they really liked it or world-class example of style, and you walk away with nothing. And so, it was hard to use any.
For all the home brewers out there, it is just as frustrating for professional brewers.
Yeah, totally.
Who get notes on competition industry entries as it is for home brewers.
I mean, even from homebrew days, it's easy to use when you're doing terribly. It is easy to take. There's usually a lot of good criticism and a lot of learning lessons, and going from good to great has been a difficult battle, and something, we're not satisfied with where double IPA is, and I don't think we ever will be. I mean, we have certainly made a lot of similar batches, but we're always like trying someone else's beer and looking for something new. And I think some of the tangible things we've done with that beer is, we've played with the hop combination is Galaxy, Mosaic, Enigma with Citra just on the hot side with 10 minutes left in the boil. It's 90-minute, kind of old school. I know we have a bittering edition, which is almost unheard of these days.
I'm shocked.
Yeah. I mean, me too. Honestly, if I was making the same recipe again, there would not be a first wort edition hop. First wort with Nugget from Crosby, awesome hop, underrated, really great clean
with
bitterness.
Nugget, you're not just using extract or Magnum or something big like that?
No, I mean, Nugget's pretty big. I've just always liked it. It's kind of one of those things, admittedly, it's somewhat of a fail-safe. Certainly have used other hops there, but I just, year after year, it's very consistent, very clean, really driving bitterness it's controllable and doesn't bring any of that harsh neck kind of bitterness you can get. So that's been my go-to.
The neck bitterness.
You know what I'm talking about, though, where it's like, it's on your palate, it's off your palate is how I want bitterness to be in West Coast IPA. And right. I think certain hop varietals are more likely, even if the data, because that's a beer that we make enough that we have gotten it lab tested for IBUs quite often. They'll come back, within 3 to 4 the same, but different hop varietals tend to have, different ways of pronouncing their type of bitterness. And I find Nuggets to be firm, somewhat soft in the way, like in its perception, and then on and off your palate. And that I think, double IPA is a style that I think is not very sessionable. Like, you think of it as being powerful and overwhelming. And so one of my goals in creating that beer was to make a beer that fit that style, but drank like the opposite, that drank like, that drank like Alpha 32 from Cannonball, but it was 9.3% instead. So you wanted it to be on and off your palate. I mean, as much as you can accomplish that with making, 18.7 Plato beer.
Right.
So, the ways we've done that since the beginning were high use of dextrose. We actually use some bigger malts than people might think. It's a blend of Maris Otter. It's actually predominantly Maris Otter with some Fireman Pilsner malt in it. Touch of Vienna, which is kind of, I think, a lot of people's classic, but all the guys on my brew staff, anytime I read a new recipe, they're like, let's guess, it's like 2% Vienna, 3% dextrose, and you picked a new baseball. And I'm like, fuck, they got me again. But that's the recipe. It blended 2 base malts, but that's the recipe. But this time, like 5.5% dextrose. So, mashed lauter, I mean, it's basically a big single IPA with enough dextrose to, move it up into the 18s in the Plato and dry it out bone dry. And then, over the years, I think we've, per style, but also just like our preferences have kept, like I was talking earlier, lowering those IBUs, moving more and more of the hop load into the whirlpool, and then of recent moving even some of what was in the whirlpool just into the dry hop. And
from a percentage basis, how much of your total hops load, you have a rough number of pounds per barrel that you're throwing into this, and then how does that kind of break out percentage wise between hot side, cold side, and the various stages of addition?
So this is one of the beers where we use cryo hops. So people understand those differently in terms of what their value association should be. But I want to say ballpark, we've been as high as 4.5 pounds, 4 pounds per barrel on the hot side, and as low as 4.5 or 5 pounds per barrel on the dry hop, and now we're in a more of like a 3.5 and just shy of 7, depending on finish yield on the dry hop.
Boy, that's cheap beer.
Yeah, we try to. Hopefully, none of my other 3 partners will listen to this. No, but that's a beer. Like I said, it's dear to our heart. We use some really cheap hops with Galaxy and Enigma from Australia
Right.
in it. And but no, I think what we've learned as we continue to make that beer, we had Vic's Secret in it for a while, and then when I became familiar with Enigma, I was like, this is the piece that's been missing. It needed that punchy. I mean, don't get me wrong, Enigma can almost have that like rubbery kind of thing going on, like burnt tire kind of action, which is not very positive. But when it's used with a deft of hand with other more eccentric tropical hops, I think it gives it some punch. And I think that's one of the tweaks we've made. Like I said, we've over the years moved up the amount of dextrose that's in it. And we've continued to play with the ratios of every year. We change the ratios of Galaxy, the 3 hops at play. I mean, ballpark, it's 40% Galaxy, 40% Mosaic, 20% Enigma. But when we get new cuts of hops every year, we, within 5, just, maybe even 10% move those numbers around to accommodate changes in all of those. Because, we're pushing to make over 1,500 barrels of beer this year, and as anybody who's professionally brewing knows, that makes us nowhere near getting to call
Right.
what hops we get. Luckily we've got some friends in some high places that help us out with some of those hops, and I can't name who they are because then everybody would know to ask them.
Fair enough.
But that so that's our approach every time, is thinking about how we can play with the flavors. Like, I like to think of those beers, once you've made them and you've got a goal, is, a bullet point. A lot of people, when I was at a big brewery like Breckenridge, has very defined QC goals. Ours are simpler. And realistically, there's, 4 guys that drink a lot of beer. And we rarely have enough time to all sit it down and drink it and analyze it for more than 10 minutes. And there's certainly no like white room or something we all do it in. So I try to keep it simple. And that's, if you were to find the beer in your head when it's not near you, what makes up that beer? And for double IPA, I think it has very punchy hop aroma mixing, some high notes of citrus with blueberry and then other tropical notes. And I will admit I didn't have the clarity there, because depending on the hop year, that can be papaya, guava, or it can be more kind of mango-y. But we deal with the cards we're dealt based with the Galaxy that year. And then it's going to have that punchiness from the Enigma. And then hopefully it's palate wrecking almost in the mid palate in terms of just hop flavor, just soaking through the retronasal finish. And then it's off your tongue immediately in terms of bitterness. And there's no fusel alcohols. So maybe I made 6 bullet points. That might have been too many. But all right, each batch of beer, are we accomplishing those goals? And, if we get new hops in and we're smelling them, you can smell them, you can put them in some hot water and see what happens. But until you're making beer with them, a lot of those finer, corrections can't quite be made. And so that's the goal. Can you think about those bullet points, and are you checking them off? And, hopefully you are. I mean, that's, I think, what makes you professional brewers. If you can smell, taste, read the analytics on the ingredients, and then put a beer on the table that smells like what you said it was going to, or tastes like what you said it was going to. So, that's our goal of that beer. And I think, as new ingredients have been available, and like I said, as the public palate has changed towards lighter bitterness, it's actually almost made that goal more achievable. Because previously I might have had this notion 3 or 4 years ago that double IPA had to be one level of bitterness. And I've had a number of people remark to me, just, drinkers at the bar, this double IPA is not very bitter. It's like, no, it is not. I think we get it in like 58 to 60 IBUs, which is, it's not very many, but at a beer that starts at 19 Plato, 18.7 Plato, it's not very much. So I think, we've also changed our vision of what those bullet points should be, or what defines West Coast IPA, West Coast double IPA. that's kind of helped us shape where we want it to be. A lot of it's in the minutia. I mean, everybody's recipes have, Citra, Simcoe, and something in them.
Right.
But it's like, when are you adding them? What are you looking for when you're picking hops? And, and how do they interact with yeast? I think that's something that's often underlooked. We used an English yeast 002 or the Fuller's strain, and we think playing with a lot of those kind of orange marmalade-y, red apple kind of ester profiles help us have what is kind of the Westbound West Coast vibe. It's the yeast, and this beer is
so you're not using Caliel yeast for your
no, I maybe
West
should have
Coast
led with
IPAs.
that. That's
Man, you're just burying the lead here.
yeah, I know this. Well, I had to have a couple of people tell you should talk to me. So it's like I'm not used to these things.
For sure. Let's talk about that, because that's pretty incredible. How many different yeast strains have you been playing with to make your West Coast IPAs? And, as you've experimented with some of these yeast strains, let's talk about what you've learned through using some of them.
So dating back to Hogshead days, like I said, I was just basically sneaking those beers in. And we used A69 from BSI, which is the Timothy Taylor's strain, which obviously, via Landlord or Bolt Maker, I think is the hoppier one. But, if you've ever been in England and had those beers fresh, they're shocking examples of English pale ale. So I was using those and, just became so familiar with them. I mean, we used those two strains exclusively for everything I did for 5 years. So when picking what the house strain for Westbound was going to be, I've always been a fan of using more characterful yeast. And, I think in a lot of beer development, more important than anything is understanding your yeast, being able to manipulate it. You're scoping it, of course, but being able to, pick pitching rates as a way to manipulate ester profile. And we'll talk about that again in barley wine in a second, but it's like that's a huge part of really mastering any beer style. If you don't know everything about your yeast and that's going to make the whole beer, then you're not really in a good situation to win. So for me, some of it was necessity. It's what I already knew really well. But I loved, it was Westbound started at a time where fruitier hop character was taking to the forefront. So, I know a lot of these English yeasts are all the craze in hazy IPA, but it was like something I've been working with for a long time, and not like in a non-similar way. Everyone's using these non-flocculent yeasts that won't dry out. And I think it's honestly made everyone scared of English yeasts that try to make West Coast IPA. Like we were making the beer with Melvin and they're like, yeah, we'll use your house yeast, but is it going to be dry? And I was like, yeah, it's going to finish like 1.6 Plato. They're like, what? I was like, yeah, dude, it's not everybody's got the, stuff that won't flocculate that leaves 5 Plato beer half finished.
Right.
So, and some of that's training. We've had it banked at
As Stephen has said, he makes bright beer, with these English yeasts. And those English yeasts, yes, they make very bright beer if you treat them in certain ways, for sure.
Totally. And West Coast IPA, over the years, I've gotten softer on it. It should be clear-ish, at least. Ours are very clear, but it should be, I have no disrespect for when they're not clear, but, that's part of it. Now that there's been a clear division, you get it.
Right.
And we make both, for the record. That's kind of how the West Coast, the Western Conference All-Stars started too, was, the sports thing I mentioned, but we had started having success with hazy IPAs, and I needed an excuse to get back to what I really loved. So, and our whole team did. All the brewers, I think, there are more passionate about West Coast IPA than hazies. That being said, we're beer nerds. So it's awesome approaching any challenge like we were talking about. It's like I've had as much fun designing hazy IPA as I have any beer I've ever made. At the end of the day, though, I might drink 2 or 3 in a row when we have a new one come out. But like what I'm drinking when I'm like watching the NBA Finals is definitely going to be either that hoppy pills or one of these West Coast IPAs. That's what I'm drinking when, turning the brain off and just drinking beer. So, this one's kind of interesting. This is a switch up on yeast, this La Cumbre beer that's coming out next week. Fun juxtaposition. Liquid Gravity, some badass guys. Head brewer there used to run Central Coast, who won a slaughter of medals over like the last decade. It was at Firestone Walker before then. And then Irway had this crazy new yeast, A72 from BSI, which I believe, somebody fact check me. That's important these days if I'm wrong. But I think that's the old Anchor yeast, which is not Anchor steam yeast. It's like what was used in Liberty Ale and Old Foghorn and those beers. So kind of a fun throwback. It was described to me by Jeff as being like...
That's like more West Coast than West Coast. My gosh.
I know. So it's but it's like nuttier and fruitier than Chico, but otherwise roughly behaves like it. And he wanted to use Sabro in this, which I had previously put, from the first time I smelled that hop, that was like a hazy IPA only hop. But mixed with Citra Mosaic, kind of a classic West Coast combo. And I think it's quite fun. I mean, this kind of Sabro we got is more on the pineapple side than like the toasted coconut side, more like pina colada mix vibe. And I think it plays quite nice with the citrus and kind of funky, almost cannabis mosaic vibes. So fun beer. And, another example of like very broad goals, right? Didn't, new base malt, new yeast, Sabro recontextualized for us. And this one was, call it a collab, but this is kind of just like an Irway showcase. He's like, let me show you how you do it, young. Let me show you how you do it, young boy. You listen to me. Yeah, I was like, hey man, I'm listening to you.
When he starts talking, we all just listen. Yeah, no, a lot of fantastic brewing knowledge in that guy. And I've had some fantastic conversations with him right here on this very podcast, as a matter of fact. Any other interesting yeast that you've played with in this West Coast IPA realm that have produced results that were noteworthy?
Yeah, we played out with the Cali Super Dry. We've done... I'm going to blank on the number right now, but the London Dry Ale, we've done London Ale 3, both for hazies and West Coast. We've played around, like I said, we've done Tim Taylor's when we've gone session IPA.
You've made some clear IPAs with London Ale 3?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Crystal clear. We've also made some hazy IPAs that ended up not being hazy in London Ale 3. I think we didn't can that one. I think we just said it was like hazy-ish or something.
Let's shift gears. We're at a point now where I think we need to start talking about barley wine, and I've wrung all of the West Coast IPA knowledge from you. I mean, I bet we could talk for another hour and still get even more.
I don't even really have any West Coast IPA knowledge, so if you got any out, that was incredible. And like I said, anything I got, I just kind of stole from Cannonball and Comrade.
It only took like 50 minutes to get into. Yeah, we're not even doing it with Cali Ale yeast, but I digress. Let's talk about barley wine, and then specifically barrel-aged barley wine, because it does seem that as we start talking about barley wine now, as opposed to barley wine 5 or 8 years ago, or barley wine when I started drinking it, which was roughly, 20 years ago, barley wine was a very different thing at that point. It was hoppy. It was very American, barley wine now, obviously for this entire category, barrel aging seems to be a defining feature for it, as people want to drink high ABV beer in this 12, 13, 14, 15% ABV range. Generally speaking, it makes sense from a value proposition and from a overall taste and conception, proposition to throw it into barrels. So as you're envisioning this beer, talk to me about that process of thinking about the beer that you're going to make, knowing that you're going to put it into barrels. It's probably going to sit there for 12 or 18 months, maybe longer, and then, become a finished beer in the long run. How do you start thinking about it from a design perspective?
So, yeah, I think, first and foremost, I could not have more passion for barley wine and old ale, and so it's awesome to get to talk about it, and if 4 people listen, it's awesome. But these beers are fun to design, and as I basically try to interrupt my own conversation with West Coast IPA to try to talk about barley wine 35 minutes ago.
Solid attempt.
You were like, no, this is not the moneymaker. Talk about West Coast IPA. which I get, and that's why we do it. But barley wine, I mean, first and foremost, I was put off often in the beginning of my craft beer career and craft beer fandom with what barley wine was in America. Because it was these big, hoppy, ridiculous things, sometimes in barrels, sometimes not, unapproachable, undrinkable, and really inappropriate for any part of my personal lifestyle. I don't know when you need ferociously hoppy, oaky, tannic, hoppy 14% beer. It's just, there's not, it's not like that's an after dinner drink. You basically have to just be a crazy raging alcoholic to need that for any reason.
Sure.
I'm not saying
big does not need to be ragged, hot, loosely uncontrolled, and all over the place. Yeah,
totally. But I think as brewing science and craft beer's kind of art form in America has progressed, there's been, in my opinion, some of the best examples ever. That I find more enjoyable, and it's why we make them as such. We vaguely call this English style barley wine. And by vaguely, I mean it is influenced by and derivative from English style barley wine. And
English style also meaning it's not that hoppy compared to American barley wine and expectations around that.
Certainly, yeah. And I think also meaning that there is forward ester profile yeast character needs to be at least moderately prevalent to extremely prevalent. And I know a lot of times when I'm hanging out with brewers and they come over to my house and they go into my wine cellar in my basement, I collect a lot of wine, love drinking scotch, and of beer, it's just goose and barley wine is basically, and a lot of barley wine, and a lot of English barley wine. But I love drinking.
So a lot of Thomas Hardy's and
Thomas Hardy. I love the old the vintage ale series from Fuller's, J.W. Lee's. Really, just a lot of those Fuller's vintage ales. They're bottle conditioned flawlessly. I mean, some phenomenal beers. Interesting characters. So taking beers that are like influenced from that, building them way bigger, knowing they're going into a barrel. And then, like I discussed 45 minutes ago or whatever, these beers are fun because I think as a brewer, a lot of brewers get into brewing for a number of reasons. One of them usually is you like drinking beer. But it's like a problem solving contest of some sorts. It's like, maybe you like Sudoku or whatever, or, I don't know, maybe you're like really good at, math, and when they do the problem-solving math questions. But it's like, I feel like brewers, like a lot of them when I meet them, whether they're more of an artist approach or more of a scientific approach, and maybe they blend both, there's something about, getting to the best solution and having the best product in the glass. And you've got to sometimes just, solve and make right disparate ideas. And barrel-aged barley wine is a great example of that. You get a beer that people are going to age a long time in a bottle, after you've aged it a long time in a barrel, that's going to finish at a relatively high finishing gravity. So you've got a micro problem. No one wants it to be hot, but you're going to make it outrageously alcoholic. Another hoop to jump through. And then it's got to still seem soft and creamy and very caramel forward and fit into, in my mind, like a dessert beverage scenario. So how do you accomplish all those things at once? You solve one problem, you create another. And that's kind of why these things are fun to think about. So when we were designing the Louie series, admittedly I had to kind of even look back on my own notes because we've been making this beer for 3 years now. And it's like, that's the hard part. Like you make IPA and like I was saying, you have an idea, it jumps in your head, you go down a rabbit hole, you read a ton of articles on the NBA website or whatever. You produce a beer and 16 days later you're drinking said beer and you're drawing conclusions and reconsidering. And in this case, 10 to 16 months pass before, you're positive you've either done something right or made a mistake or know where you're going to change next year's. So the learning curve is slower.
You've potentially brewed next year's release before you've even really had the current release at a point where you are able to learn everything you want to learn from it.
We're definitely pulling nails and tasting barrels and getting them sent, for micro and everything. So we have an idea of what we've done and what we've corrected, but, and not to be too nerdy, but I think a lot of the crux of making high gravity beer, for which, unlike barrel-aged stout, where there's room to hide behind, hide behind's the wrong term, but like there's so much going on with barrel-aged stout. And this is toffee, caramel. Can you integrate oak? Can you keep fusel alcohols low? And can you keep fruity esters high? That's kind of the whole beer, right? And if you can nail all those things, you almost have cognac in a glass that's thicker, and it's awesome. So how can you make those things happen? Well, a lot of that revolves around free amino nitrogen. And the reason for that being, and then also Strecker degradation, aldehyde formations in the kettle. So what I mean by that is there's two ways people get these huge gravity beers, stouts or barley wines. They're for the most part either adding dry malt extract directly to it and or boiling the hell out of these beers.
Right.
I'm not of that school. We are in double mash camp, and for one reason, boiling the hell out of these liquids, specifically with direct fire, which is, by space restrictions, what we have, is putting a lot of heat stress on this. There's no way to keep all oxygen out, even as you're cooling, and you're inevitably removing a lot of the natural antioxidants in the beer, and creating substrates for which other aldehyde formations will later form. And again, you've got to be thinking that way. Like when you're making pub beer at Hogshead, I was not thinking that way. All this beer was served insanely fresh and none of it would make it past 90 days. But when you're making beer, you're going to put it in a barrel for 14 months and then someone else, and then you're going to put it in a bottle for 3 months before you sell it. And then most of your customers age bottles, like you said, you've got one that's now 16 months old. You got to be thinking about, a lot of the stuff I thought was a joke when I was 21 years old, like hot side aeration. Who knew, does that matter? No, when you're making beer that everyone drinks in 60 days. But all these finer details start to matter then. So I'm of the school double mash and never boiling more than 2 hours, which is on both stout and barley wine, for these reasons listed. That being said, I've now created a new hoop to jump through, which is, if anyone out there is thinking of it, who's thinking of free amino nitrogen, I've already mentioned, I've now just doubled up the amount of malt in it, not boiled the hell out of it. So my nitrogen levels on an all malt beer are now even higher. And that's when we get into pitching rate and thinking about these other goals. So we've got, we're looking for high ester production, which to me immediately makes me think low pitching rate, especially when working with English yeast strains. So I think another thing that a lot of breweries make the mistake of is they're dead ending. And, to define that just meaning like that's the last pitch, they're not going to harvest again. And it's the end of, however many generations is normal there. I think I would advise.
They've stepped up through some smaller beers potentially, and now boom, it goes into their barley wine.
Yeah, and I'm a big fan of training. We sometimes will harvest off double IPA for barley wine or for Russian Imperial Stout. I think there's some value in that. It might just feel good. I'm not really sure. I can't prove it, but it feels good that it ferments 19 Plato before you give it 32. But more importantly, that we're looking at yeast vitality and viability need to be low generation and exceptional, because we're going to intentionally underpitch these beers, to the tune of, we underpitch Fuller's ESP yeast 002 in most of our beers to the tune of 750,000 cells per mil per degree Plato. Usually if you go high gravity or if you have sugar involved, you'd go, 1.25 to maybe 1.5 mil. I know people that would pitch 2 million cells in the scenario that they're going 32 Plato. We have the opposite approach. Let the yeast be incredibly healthy. And, sometimes admittedly, day of, it's a Friday, you're brewing it. You don't have to get a video from the bar manager. You're coming in on Saturday. So I might get talked into 1 million, but you want to keep those cell counts low. And the reason being that fan we were just talking about, you get a lot of it to eat up. You've got very active yeast because you've designed that in your schedule. And I want all this ridiculous 32 Plato all malt wort fan to be eaten up. That is why we've selected a blend of Golden Promise and Maris Otter. Maris Otter is awesome for, all the Bill fans out there. I think, everybody's got the Maris Otter shirt and whatever.
The barley wine is life, yes.
Yeah. But Golden Promise, especially from Simpsons, has even a lower fan content, trying to work that in our favor, lower protein content. High mash temp, low amounts of caramel malts, more than the color reflects. Again, just trying to keep anything that has oxidative properties or substrates for extracting them out of the beer, and keeping, precursors for aldehyde formations out of the beer. And then having a yeast situation is just going to chew all that up. Because if you were to name the worst case scenario for microbiology in a brewery, putting beer in wood with micro-oxygen, a beer that's going to finish an 8 Plato with a plethora of free amino nitrogen, that's a playground for wild yeast to come in. So, to the best of your ability, which is almost an impossible equation, this is kind of the last hoop we got to jump through, is getting that, under-pitched yeast to have massive cell growth. And that aids in one of the other goals in our check boxes, which was pushing this ester profile while keeping fusels low. Fan high, it's going to hurt us on the fusels. If we've got the amount that the yeast can eat up, we're going to keep fusels low. Pitch cold, longer fermentation, and try to extend that growth period. I think all play a great role in making really great high gravity beer that doesn't drink excessively boozy. And we use a lot of these same ideas.
When you say pitch cold, what does that mean?
For that yeast, probably 62.5, 63 degrees. Hold it. We're normally pitching 002 around 64.5 and fermenting for 66.5 for 24 hours, then going to 70. Here we're going to go 62, 63, and then move it up like 2 degrees every 24 hours, like hold at 65 and just keep going gradually up and really controlling the pace at which that fermentation is going to happen. It's scary because you think you might be making, caramel syrups at some point if it doesn't keep going.
You're going to just make this thing stall.
But, I think that's where picking yeast strains that are incredibly healthy shape early on gives you the confidence that, we don't want, especially in these products. Consumers, when they're paying, $17 for this 500 ml bottle or $25 for big bottles or, whatever you're seeing for these high-end barley wines.
Right.
But, when the stakes are that high, you can't, your strategy can't be for I hope this goes decently, So I think we work with those strategies to try to create this, like I was describing, you're jumping through a number of hoops. And it's how can we have this very ester-forward beer with low fusel alcohols, considering we're going to have a 15% alcohol product being put in the barrel at the end, that is nuanced with yeast character, has huge caramel and toffee notes, which an easy solution to that in beer design would also be to choose a lot of caramel malts. Can't do that because, you can do that, but again, the longevity of that beer in the barrel or in the bottle that you have that's 3 years old starts diminishing. So also trying to keep overall hop load relatively low. All these things that favor longevity and favor, oxidation that will be more sherry and toffee-like and not be papery, or help in the formation of off-putting aldehyde kind of formations, or precursors to trans 2-nonol. So how can you not make it papery? How can you not make it stale, but make it sherry? And not literally sherry, but you know what I'm saying. How do you get those positive oxidative notes and make it take it on beautifully with age? And I think, like I said, are there
specific malts that you lean to now? You've mentioned that you're using a lot of Maris Otter, you're using a lot of Golden Promise. But when I look at this, there's a nice brown barley wine color. As I get further down in the glass, I see that color is lighter than it may have looked when I initially poured it. But then at the same time, you're only boiling it for 2 hours. And so you're not just getting a 6 or a 12 hour like Maillard, boiled down kind of, deep color to it. What's the secret sauce in that is adding this kind of richness, color, toffee and caramel character, but doing it without adding this oxidative character?
So, two pieces. We use, this recipe verbatim is 4% flaked maize to actually reduce our fan. And then is 50%, minus acid malt, which I can't spit off the top, for whatever pH control, do whatever makes sense to get that right. But effectively we're targeting almost like pale ale type numbers, going into a fermenter at 5.1 to 5.2 pH. Regular mash pHs, 4% crystal 120, and that's it. But we double mash it, and there's a humongous amount of malt that goes into this. So I think a lot of times people are unaware how much color you can get by just using literally a shit ton of base malt. We rely on that and let those colors.
I just poured some more just for science, just because I have to look at this in the glass and admire its opacity and and kind of nutty brown color.
No, it is surprising. Anytime we talk about it, it looks. If you were to make ESB, for example, which, as I mentioned, I've made a lot in my career at Hogshead, that would be like a 10% C77 or C120 kind of beer. But that isn't necessary when you get into these crazy malt loads, where literally we're running off 100% base malt beer, collecting a 24 Plato mash, and then running that back into what would be, a Imperial style beer, but using the first runnings as our strike liquor. And we're running off like 44 Plato first runnings. It's absurd. To put that in perspective, maple syrup is like 52 Plato, So, it's, shit is thick. Like we literally have to get hot water, 180 degree water, and blend it 50-50 with it to get any reading on a density meter or anything. It's obscenely thick liquid. And the richness comes from that density of flavor. And, that's how we're thinking about barley wine. And then, the other big key to this beer, which, if you couldn't tell, I'm very proud of, is you hire Phil Joyce to blend the barrels at the end. That guy crushes it. I'm part of like picking out which barrels we are looking for. What, in this case, what you're drinking is a blend of a XO cognac barrel blended with, we might even have to read the side of the bottle, but I want to say it's a Heaven Hill bourbon barrel. And, our bourbon barrel this year had one unused bourbon barrel, like
Dickel.
Ooh, got me. Another great.
That was just my Alex Trebek move, having to somehow correct you on your own statement there.
Well, like I said,
all I did was just read the label.
No, I could have done that. I wish I had. But yeah, so, we get it. And we also think about that too when we're designing these beers, is like what types of barrels will promote characters. Like I said, that we're looking for soft, minimizing alcohol, toffee, caramel, and then high fruit content. How do you punch this up? Well, cognac jumps to mind as kind of checking off all those boxes. Like it almost sounds like I just described cognac when saying that. So that one was easy. And then that Dickel bourbon, I think it won Bourbon of the Year this year, I believe, but maybe it was 2019.
Is that the Dickel bottle and bond?
Yeah, and but you're thinking about that big, sweet, burnt sugar character, and how do these components work, and having great relationships with barrel brokers, everybody, yada yada yada. Everybody does that, but not for it to be minimized. I think it's very important. Rocky Mountain Barrel Company, Noah, the Kentucky Barrel Brokers. Just some awesome dudes we're working with that get us. We tell them what we're looking for. They work with us on profile, and that we're creating multiple versions of this Louie, and what each version's where it's going to be driven by barrels. We've got the bourbon barrel Louie, the double barrel Louie, and then King Louie was our member barrel that was just single barrel cognac.
What do hops look like in this beer? What do you use? And, what is the overall like kind of IBU goal? Obviously these beers are going to live for a while in barrels. And so, you want to give them some structure that'll allow them to hold up to that without the hops kind of dominating and taking over the flavor.
No, definitely. And I think, we've moved that number around as this series has developed. I mean, I think that original bottle you have, we were targeting more like a 13% alcohol beer and like an 8.5, 9 Plato finishing gravity. I think the one you're drinking is closer to 10. And we'd gone from 29 to 32 on the starting. And so it's a moving target. But effectively, I think a lot of people get afraid to put any hops in these beers. And then you get this marshmallow thing that's cool up front that is just cloying and outrageous and bordering on offensive after you've had more than 3 or 4 ounces. So on this particular version, and again, maybe one of the 4 guys I make beer with is just going to laugh at this because I'm just dead wrong, but I feel like it's about 40 to 45 IBUs. Calculated, again, not tested. We've been as high as 55 in this year's batch, which was, we keep trying to push the limits of how big we can make them going into barrel. But I think what's key there is just targeting residual sweetness and almost using those, like, not that it's a real metric, but finishing gravity divided by IBUs to render some number, and then trying to, if you like that level of residual bitterness, if you can even call that in this, but balance against sweetness might be a better description. Using that as a relative number to jump off. I mean, it's a made up unit, but it gives you something, right? And it's like, hey, we're mashing at 157 this year, 158, and we're pushing those limits of where we think we're going to finish as we, push the Plato even higher and higher starting in the mash temp. So maybe we're pushing IBUs, even further. It's a relative number every year. And it's a fun time of year. We're actually just got barrels of stout and barley wine being sent off to get tested at labs. Of barrels we're excited about for early blends for members and stuff. So already tasting, last year's beer and starting to think about, what Louie looks like in 2022, which is crazy. You have to be thinking like that. But
in 2022.
Yeah. So it's fun though. And it's I talk about this with the breweries I've already mentioned in this talk. If you don't think you're making the best beer that's in that conversation every single time, there's a lot of easier ways to make money that are more fulfilling. Like Westbound Down, without a doubt, is in this because we think we bring some of the conversation every time we make beer. And that is arrogant, and we are aware of it. But it isn't because we want to be arrogant. It's just because we're literally trying that hard. We're staying up at night. We got a team of guys that this is what they think about. This is what they dream about. This is, what they're doing. And that's what craft beer is. That's why it's an amazing field. You talk to, like I said, I've just named easily 3 other breweries in Colorado that I'm good friends with that all have that approach. And, Hutch, literally before World Beer Cup was canceled, was texting me knowing we entered Session IPA. And he's like, Phil texted him, hey, you want to make a bet on the Session IPA, category. And Hutch said something like, what do you want to bet? And Phil was coming out with whatever. He's like, how about whoever wins gets a shiny plaque? And if you need to know what it looks like, come by our hallway. We got 4 or 5 of them hanging up. And so, and I would never describe, Hutch is one of the most humble people I know, but my point being, everybody who I love in this industry is hungry as hell. And they want more, and they want to, and they believe they believe in themselves, and they believe that they're continuously getting better. And if you weren't, it would be boring. Waking up and thinking you've already done your best work is at best sad and kind of depressing, potentially worse. And I think waking up and thinking every day we're getting better and we're on this chase, it's almost nice because now we're coming for you again next year and best beers of the year, So
Jake, the way we normally finish things off is the classic question: what does success look like for Westbound and Down?
Well, I feel like we've somewhat been talking on it in the ways of, defining goals and figuring out how you get through those hoops. And I think we think about our company that same way. I know one of the hoops is we never want to stop making the best beer we think is possible. And then, if we can have, that's goal number one, that's hoop number one, we got to get through that. And then we think about whether we can create great experiences. We love making food with beer. We plan on doing that in the space we're sitting right now. So I know we're going to continue focusing on making that world-class beer and then having great chefs put awesome complimentary food with it in a great experience, whether that's take-home beer or from us. And then, the last hoop is whether we can keep growing as people and giving back to the community and being part of the awesome Colorado craft beer community. If we can get through all those hoops, which again, kind of have that same deal where it's the easiest way to get through any one of those hoops might not be the same way, might make one of the other hoops harder. So if we can thread the needle through those, that's how we'll define success at Westbound.
That sounds good. Nearly 2,000 breweries across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico partner with G&D Chillers. Try Leopold Brothers Malt from BSG. Mountain Rose Herbs offers the highest quality organic herbs, spices, and teas. Yakima Valley Hops is your hop source, whether you're brewing 5 gallons or 5 barrels. ABS Commercials giving away a Keg Viking keg washer live on December 5th. And Craft Beer and Brewing's All Access subscriptions are the best way to support this very podcast. So, Jake, if people want to learn more about Westbound and Down, what you all do, the locations that you have, and the beer that you make, where do they find you guys?
Westboundanddown.com, at Westbound and Down Brewing, I believe. You promised me this moment was coming, and I think I botched it anyways. And then, but Instagram and Facebook, easy to find on Facebook. And then I've got the handle, come on, internet. Westbound and Down Brewing Co. At Westbound and Down Brewing Co. is our Instagram. I think that's the easiest place to catch us. If you hop on right now, you can see the newest update about the beer we released today for Hops and Pie's 10th anniversary. He told me I'd get a shameless plug in, so I'm punching it. Their 10th anniversary Saturday, we made a special version of Westbound IPA with Pacific Sunrise hops that's really fun. And it's got cartoon pictures of their faces on the logo. It's quite fun beer. I'm sending you home with some. Nice, and that's that's all I got. But thanks for listening. Hopefully you'll edit this down from the hour and 45 minutes or whatever. Maybe cut out some of the West Coast IPA.
We're at an hour and 46 minutes. If you're driving through Idaho Springs, Colorado, definitely stop at the brew pub. And once this location in Lafayette, Colorado gets up and running, definitely check them out here. Jake Gardner, head brewer for Westbound and Down Brewing in Idaho Springs and now Lafayette, Colorado. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks, Jamie. It was awesome.
Cheers. I thank you.
Thanks, man.
This podcast is brought to you by Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine for those that love to make and drink great beer. Learn more online or subscribe at beerandbrewing.com or find us on social media at Craft Beer Brew.